When it comes to destroyers, their service career can often be summed up as long stretches of boredom with a moment of utter terror. HMS Javelin is a classic example of this. With her moments of excitement, including one engagement with German surface forces, that saw her very nearly sink. That Javelin didn't sink is a testament to her builders and the tenacity of her crew. Let's take a look at that story in this video. HMS Javelin was laid down on October 11th, 1937, and launched on December 21st, 1938. As a J-class destroyer, Javelin was a fairly average ship for the late 1930s. This class of destroyer came equipped with 3 twin 4.7-inch gun mounts in a fairly typical layout. 2 mounts on the bow, with one superfiring over the other, and a third mount towards the stern. These were joined by 2 quintuple 21-inch torpedo tubes for a total of 10 torpedoes, along with a handful of anti-aircraft guns. All of this was carried on a hull of 2,300 tons at full load that could go around 36 knots. Not the quickest destroyers around, but certainly on the higher end. That said, with her technical details covered, let's return to service history. Javelin commissioned into the Royal Navy on June 10, 1939. For those who know their history, that's only a couple months before Germany went on their Polish adventure. As such, while retaining that new ship smell, Javelin was thrust into the Second World War in September 1939. Although it should be noted that her early war service is nothing to write home about. Javelin joined up with other destroyers for North Sea patrol duty, which kept her busy from the outbreak of the war until September 22, 1939. On that day, while participating in a planned raid against German shipping off Norway, Javelin collided with her sister, HMS Jersey. Both destroyers suffered damage here, with Javelin towed off for repairs. Those repairs kept her in dry dock until the end of October, when Javelin managed to ram a merchant ship during her post-repair sea trials. The repairs for that damage kept her in dock even longer, from November 1939 through to January 1940. Javelin missed the first couple months of the war as a result. That isn't to say she got up to much upon returning to service either. January through March saw Javelin on convoy escort duty for the most part, with an exception to the rule on March 19th, when Javelin had to escort her sister Jervis after she managed to collide with a Swedish merchant ship. The J-class was not having a good start to the war. Collisions aside, Javelin continued much the same as she had been after escorting Jervis home, alternating between escorting convoys and other warships from March through May 1940. I don't want to make this sound like it is an important service, because it very much is. However, it is also fairly mundane service as these things go. Worth mentioning, but not the most exciting thing out there. For that, we have to look at May, when Javelin was one of several destroyers picking up survivors from SS Abakur. That's a story for another video, but for now, Javelin was prompt in her attempt to pick up the few survivors. She wasn't the ship to pick up the most, but she was at least helping. Just as she helped during the evacuation of Dunkirk, one of many ships to contribute to that operation. With the conclusion of the evacuation, Javelin returned to escort duty. This she performed well, with requisite breaks for refit between June and November of 1940. It was in November, however, that Javelin had her big moment of excitement. On November 29, 1940, Javelin was part of a larger squadron in a battle with German destroyers. This engagement against Hans Lodi, Richard Beitzen, and Karl Galtzer, which I probably butchered all three, was a hectic one for the British destroyer. Javelin was battered by German gunfire and torpedoes, which caused damage that would have sunk most any other destroyer. After all, destroyers having their bow or stern blown off isn't exactly uncommon. Quite a few would survive that kind of damage. Javelin's own sister, Jervis, survived her own bow being blown off later in the war. Javelin, however, had the misfortune of losing both bow and stern in one battle. A German torpedo blew off her bow forward of her gun mounts, as you can see here in this picture. It was torn up and pushed back over her foremost gun mount. This would have been terrible but survivable damage. And then you take a look at her stern. Javelin had a large portion of that blown off by another torpedo. Her entire third gun mount, for example, is on the part that was blown away. That would also have been survivable damage in isolation. Between the two hits, Javelin lost about half her hull. Javelin was originally 356 feet, or 108 meters, long. After those torpedo hits, only 155 feet, 47 meters of the ship remained afloat. Through Herculean damage control efforts, despite losing 46 men, Javelin remained afloat. The central hulk of the ship was towed off for repairs. I'm sure it was a morale boost for the British. I am also sure it wasn't easy to basically rebuild the ship from scratch after that kind of damage. Javelin remained in repairs through the entirety of 1941. She only returned to active duty in February of 1942. This was, once more, escort duty. Considering what the ship had just gone through, I don't think the crew was complaining much. Assuming any of her original crew was still aboard, that is. That said, her escort duty was short-lived in this case. Javelin was assigned to support the landings in French Madagascar in May of 1942. That operation, codenamed Ironclad, saw her sail halfway across the globe to the Indian Ocean. Javelin continued escort duty during this, but she did get the chance to put her main battery to use in gunfire support on May 5, 1942. When that operation was finished, Javelin detached from that group and moved to the Mediterranean. Here she would remain for a good chunk of the war, continuing her typical destroyer job. I won't go into too much detail on this period, outside of a couple examples, because it would largely amount to she escorted this convoy from point A to point B on repeat. The first exception to that rule came early in her Mediterranean service. In June of 1942, Javelin was assigned to Operation Vigorous. This attempt to resupply Malta would prove less than successful. Constant air attacks and the threat of the Italian surface fleet forced the convoy to return to Alexandria instead of pushing on to the destination. Javelin, by all accounts, served well here. One destroyer was not, however, going to do much to influence the outcome. That said, Javelin almost became a hero for the Australians. HMAS Nestor, an Australian destroyer, was heavily damaged during the air attack. Javelin took her under tow and attempted to get her to Alexandria. Unfortunately, the damage to Nestor was too severe. She was taking on too much water for damage control to handle, and Javelin had to abandon the tow. Her crew was taken aboard the British destroyer, and the Australian ship was scuttled on June 16, 1942. The remainder of 1942 was substantially less exciting, with the exception of some small actions at the end of the year and into the first month of 1943. This began with the sinking of the Italian torpedo boat Lupo on December 2nd. This also probably qualifies as bullying. 4 British destroyers against 1 torpedo boat, armed with only 3 4-inch guns and 4 18-inch torpedoes. Not to mention that Lupo was occupied helping the survivors of a sinking Italian merchant ship. After that was done, Javelin's next action against the Italians came on December 13, 1942. Alongside other destroyers, she attacked a convoy off the coast of Tunisia. And then, on January 19th, 1943, Javelin joined HMS Kelvin in attacking a formation of Italian ships. 6 minesweepers, a trawler, a patrol boat, and a pump boat. This, much like the action against Lupo, was very lopsided. The Italians had numbers, but the minesweepers were only armed with a single 3-inch gun and a couple machine guns. The other ships only had machine guns. Suffice it to say, Javelin and Kelvin had a field day. They expended about 800 rounds of ammunition between them, but they sank every single Italian ship. However, this was nearly the end of her exciting wartime service. Javelin returned to escort missions, along with the odd bombardment mission, until she returned to Britain in July 1943 for a much-needed refit. This kept her in port from July through December 1943. Javelin returned to service in February 1944, but by this point much of the action was over, at least in the European theater. Even during the Normandy landings in June, Javelin missed most of the action, with the notable exception, that is, of one final engagement with the Germans. On June 9th, 1944, Javelin was part of an Allied squadron that engaged a group of German destroyers. This multinational formation, consisting of British, Canadian, and Polish ships, was far superior to the German formation. It was 8 destroyers arrayed against 3 German destroyers and 1 torpedo boat. The result is, perhaps, predictable. For 1 destroyer damaged, the British forced the Germans to scuttle 1 destroyer, while another was run aground. As an interesting historical side note, the scuttled destroyer was an ex-Dutch destroyer that had been scuttled incomplete when the Germans overran the country. They promptly refloated her and put her into service. That aside, this was the last excitement for Javelin. She returned to escort duties before managing to collide with HMS Eskimo on July 7th, 1944. This caused some heavy damage to her stern and forced her to enter dry dock for yet more repairs. This lasted until December 31st, 1944, which means that Javelin didn't return to service until January 1945. By this point, she had spent about as much time in dry dock, for various reasons, as in actual service. Of course, by this point, the war was largely over. It would end in May in Europe, and the Pacific War was winding down outside of kamikaze attacks. Javelin wouldn't even see those as she rounded out her service in the Mediterranean, mostly because of a need to go into dock in Alexandria to fix up boiler tubes. The most exciting thing to happen during this period was a quote-unquote mutiny, which was more like a draconian captain pushing the crew hard in a time of peace to make himself look better for promotion. The result was, on October 17th, 1945, a group of men being charged for mutiny, when they were really just protesting all of the work. As could be expected, the sentences they received were lowered when the facts came out. In any case, with the general drawdowns in the Royal Navy, HMS Javelin was decommissioned soon after the war ended, and sent to the scrapyard on June 11th, 1949. Even ignoring that she was obsolescent by that point, the ship's repeated damage and repairs were going to leave her a bit worn out, and the Royal Navy was short on funds for ships that hadn't been through so much trouble. Regardless, this is where the story of HMS Javelin comes to a quiet end. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.